Welcome to our six-part series on solving the freshwater crisis in the Eastern Caribbean. In this series, we will seek to do three things. First, we will provide you with a slice of a forgotten history of what arose when this same freshwater crisis almost obliterated the short political independence of one of the most attractive member states of the Eastern Caribbean region, Antigua. Then we will explain how, acting as a region, the Eastern Caribbean can build a sustainable water supply profile. And finally, we will outline the foundation elements that will make a brokered trade arrangement in freshwater supplies among Caribbean island states become a reality. If you're old enough, you will recall a TV show in the 1970s called Family Feud. The American comedian Steve Harvey made it even more popular in 2010. If you're too young to remember it, never mind. I will tell you how the show went. The show always opened with a familiar routine. Steve, the host, will ask a question, and the contestants would attempt to match the most popular response to that question coming from a general survey. Well, in 2020, someone in Antigua created a troll based on this opening salvo. In it, the content creator had Steve asking the contestants this question: name something that you pay for but can't seem to get. Well, young Gaston from Antigua was quick off the mark with his winning response. Well, Steve, he says, I would have to say water. And he wins. Something you pay for and you can't seem to get. While most of us who remember that show would get a laugh out of this response, the sad reality is this: that response would have been the winning answer in both time and space. What do I mean by that? Well, if you were to ask the same question, name something that you pay for but never seem to get, the most popular answer in every one of the Eastern Caribbean islands would be water. But this answer would have also won across time, spanning the known written history of water scarcity in the Eastern Caribbean from 1984 to today, 2025. In this picture, the report on the left is from 1984, while the report on the right is from 2025. In the 1984 report entitled Disaster Case Report, which was compiled by the U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance Office in 1984, the comment in the report read as follows: as reservoir levels fell to alarmingly low levels in January, the island faced the threat of a serious water shortage, widespread health problems, and a decline in tourism threatening the livelihood of 72,000 souls. That was the entire population of the island in 1984. What do you think would have been the popular response to that question in that year? The update on the right was from a 2025 report announcing that the Water Division of the APUA, that is the Antiguan Water Utility, was operating at a loss. Here's the comment in 2025. APUA can't be serious. Loss? When people are getting no water and them still send a hefty bill for the people at the end of the month? Well, we know where his sentiments lie. What happened in the British West Indies in 1984 has become a slice of history that our water system leaders are prone to forget. According to that 1984 report, three things happened. First, Antigua, which used to be referred to as the Cinderella of the West Indies, was about to be obliterated as a nation and an island community by severe shortage of fresh water. Secondly, the new government of Antigua, that is the local boys, were forced by external powers, the British, American, and Canadians, to quickly establish a task force which they called the Pan-Caribbean Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Project, PCDPPP, to deal with the drought conditions that were creating havoc across the islands that comprised the Eastern Caribbean. We're told that initially, the new government itself was reluctant to publicize the water shortage for fear of triggering a decline in tourism, which supplied 75% of the country's foreign exchange. By the end of April that year, PCDPP team had produced a set of recommendations which all sound like what we would be expecting to come from our responsible governments of today. However, the last recommendation was the revealing one. It recommended the barging of water as a last resort. The report goes on to tell us that by July of that year, conditions had worsened so much that the very powerful interests, that is, the foreign boys, created an emergency fund with the explicit purpose of implementing what the local boys called the last resort, barging water. Let us pause for a while to understand what was going on in Antigua in 1984. Suddenly, an option which was considered as a last resort within 2 months became the first resort in this survival drama. Notice, no one at that time had to do any research to find out where to get additional supplies of fresh water in the Eastern Caribbean. Everyone in the region clearly understood at that time that the only source of additional freshwater supplies was to be found in the island of Dominica. We can understand why the colonial power, that is the UK, would have been concerned. Less than 3 years after handing over the reins of power to the local boys, they were seeing their Cinderella Island being driven into the ground. But it is also necessary to understand the interests of the United States government in this part of the history of Caribbean water woes. I came across this picture of the U.S. Marines raising the American flag at the Crabs Peninsula in Antigua in 1941. This is during World War II. During World War II, this naval base had been created as a strategic part of the defense of the U.S. mainland. So you can imagine the concern in the U.S. military at the thought of its host nation, while reveling in their newborn independent status, were about to be obliterated as a community because they could not find enough water for the people. The third thing that happened in that fateful year is described as follows. A 4-member Antigua delegation headed by Public Utilities Minister Weber Jr. visited Dominica to sign an agreement to purchase water at a cost of about $3 per 1,000 gallons. The cost of barging water from the island of Dominica to the island of Antigua was $20 per 1,000 gallons. Then there was the cost of transporting the water in 1,000-gallon trucks from Crabs in the parish of St. Peter to other parts of the island. This cost ranged from $25 to $50 depending on the destination. You can read all about this in the Caribbean News Briefs, July 16, 1984. This was clearly what you may call a game changer. The beautiful island of Antigua was able to survive and breathe again by importing volumes of fresh water from the only water surplus source in the Caribbean region, Dominica. The foreign boys, by their explicit action of a transboundary and regional approach, saved Antigua. And guess what? It worked. So maybe Steve Harvey's next question in 2025 would have to be, name me a country that seems to have forgotten how it survived a water crisis 40 years ago. So here is the point. How is it that 40 years after being rescued from utter devastation, the University of Maryland at Baltimore County can publish an article in May 2024 claiming that the water crises are a growing problem across the Caribbean islands? And the Sentinel newspaper can exclaim that we don't need more time stalling promises, we need water. I'm strongly suggesting to you that our leaders are posturing instead of solving the problem. When your continued posture in regards to water security fails to substantially change anything, then your posture has to be regarded as performance art. You can call it political grandstanding or ostentatious performance aimed at impressing the people, but they all have the same effect. It is what the political elite, the technical advisors, the regional institutions have all been doing under the umbrage of a credible response to the Caribbean's water security risks. They have taken to using language and speech rather than historical economic facts to attract financial support for statements of action, which on closer inspection turn out to be hollow, lacking economic precedence, or too superficial to be regarded as a genuine attempt to resolve an existential threat. To be grammatically correct, I should be calling this performative posturing, but in a vain effort to keep the image that this is the art of performing, not problem solving, I will continue to use the noun rather than the adjective. So remember this. Performance posturing undermines solving the Caribbean water crisis. It is legitimate for anyone to ask, where does this performance posturing style of leadership that you speak of come from? Am I just making up this stuff? Or does it have real world precedence? I would have accepted your skepticism about this if it weren't for a 1968 novel written by a UWI lecturer named Archie Singham. You need to read Archie Singham's novel, The Hero and the Crowd, in which he reflects on his observations of Eric Gary's leadership in Grenada. In that work, Singham observed, and I quote him, "What posed as solutions in the pre-independence days were wrapped up in personality with raucous and bogus radicalism and tremendous braggadocio. It personified the West Indian folk hero, or the Spider-Man Anansi, who survived in a hostile world by cunningly exploiting the weaknesses of his enemies." Singham raised this alarm about the type of leadership in the pre-independence period 50 years ago. However, in 2018, another West Indian journalist, this time Elliot Harrington, wrote in the Allan Williams newspaper that doing business with the British was one way our governments of the past would get on popular public radio for the purpose of grandstanding for the national audience, ranting and shouting down the British with insults and antagonistic language, while coming back to the island with empty hands. The people who are saying these things all look like you and me and feel like you and me. The only difference I have with Elliot Harrington is that he is still hoping that this behavior has been overturned. His claim that the obvious intolerant behavior is now a thing of the past, substituted by high-level respectful dialogue in the interest of the country, That claim sounds to me like he's pleading for someone to change the leadership behavior. So I'm raising the alarm for the current generation of youth to understand that in today's Caribbean, what passes for serious solutions to emergencies like the water crisis boils down to expressions of ineffective intentions wrapped up in performance posturing, most of which have very little chance of changing our economic reality. So let us go through the water scarcity scenario in the Eastern Caribbean from the perspective of factual receipts. The performance stance on the Caribbean water shortage always starts with the rainfall level as the raison d'etre, that is, the sole ultimate purpose for this occurrence. It is the drought. As the argument goes, the primary source of freshwater endowment in the islands of the Eastern Caribbean is the low rainfall level. The main theme of this discourse is that water falls freely from the sky, but the volume that falls on our little island is insufficient to serve us all, and getting the water to where it is most needed costs a lot of money in infrastructure. We have seen where this is leading to. The concept of a failure to capture sufficient rainfall always serves as the starting point for justifying the huge financial commitments like desalination plants to solving the water crisis. Actually, it is these financial plans that have given us the first quantitative estimates of the water deficits in each island. But here is the puzzle. The same environmental forces, that is the trade winds, that bring so little water to Antigua and St. Kitts, also bring an abundance of the same to Dominica. So while some islands are getting more water, others are getting less. When you hear this argument, here is another fact you need to remember. The situation in which we find ourselves in each of our little islands is really part of a larger hydrological phenomenon that has been unfolding for millions of years, and that is likely to continue to unfold in that way in the natural universe for millions of years after we have departed this planet. So if this unequal distribution of rainfall in the region is the functioning of a hydrological domain system, then why is the unequal distribution of rainfall in the Eastern Caribbean region more favorable to Dominica than to the other islands? That is no mystery. It is the topography of Dominica which is an incidence of nature. We ourselves cannot change that. In 2009, Robert Smith led a team from Yale University's Department of Geology and Geophysics to examine the physics of orographic precipitation in the tropics. They identified Dominica as the location with pure orographic precipitation with a dominance of what they call mechanical lifting clouds. The study explained why there was such a high rainfall level in Dominica as opposed to its neighboring islands. You see, when the trade winds come up against Dominica's high mountains, the upward drift forces the clouds to release most of the moisture they are carrying. So it is the altitudes of Dominica's mountains that induce such high levels of precipitation. Therefore, the abundance of fresh water in Dominica is an incidence of nature. Notice in the profile on the screen the range of rainfall that exceeds 300 inches per annum in Dominica spans from the northern part of the island around Mont Diablotin to the southern part around Trois-Pitons and Micotrine mountains. Now you may want to know more, like why is Dominica more mountainous than the other Caribbean islands? No mystery here either. There are 21 volcanoes in the Eastern Caribbean. You see, each island in the Eastern Caribbean has one major high mountain, which is really a current or dormant volcano. That is, with the exception of the island of Dominica, which has 9 volcanoes. So the picture of our region has variables that are set in nature. That is what we are given to work with. Now we can argue that some of the fresh water that is needed in Antigua and St. Kitts fall on Dominica by virtue of how nature makes it happen when the moist air is lifted as it moves over the mountain range. Now we cannot change the way that nature endows each island in the Eastern Caribbean with rainfall levels, but we may desire to redistribute the unequal endowment of rainfall in the Eastern Caribbean once it has fallen. We can only do so, however, on a regional basis, not on an island-to-island basis. So if your concern is like mine, and it has to do with this unequal distribution of water endowment that nature has bequeathed to us, we are both onto something, because the facts will place our concerns on an unshakable foundation as the solution to the water crisis in the Caribbean starts to reveal some of its roots. Everything that has to do with water always starts with a low rainfall level. But here are 2 facts to help you understand how to read the Caribbean's low rainfall count. The first is this. When you keep Dominica out of the picture, the average rainfall in the OECS group is 46.43 inches. But when you add Dominica's rainfall back into the picture, the average rainfall level in the OECS group of islands rises to 84.88 inches. That is an amazing increase of 83%. An increase which means that there is more rainfall available for each individual in the region once Dominica's rainfall is in the picture. Here's another fact that will demonstrate the significance of the contribution of Dominica to the regional water resource base. The chart you're looking at shows the water availability per capita in 6 OECS territories. You can see, in comparison with the other islands, that the per capita water availability count for Dominica is 108% greater than its closest OECS neighbor to the north, Antigua and Barbuda, and it is 33% higher than the next highest OECS member state's water count, which happens to come from Grenada. Would Dominica endanger its own welfare if it were called upon to share some of its water resources? Well, the FAO suggests that 1,000 cubic meters of water per inhabitant is the minimum requirement for human existence. The fresh water that can be available to each individual in Dominica is 250% above the FAO minimum for human existence. The answer to that question is clearly no. It is clear what these pictures are telling us. When Dominica's rainfall is not in the picture, the problem correctly looks like a group of islands, each bordering on water stress conditions. When you add Dominica's rainfall into the picture, you see the problem takes a different flavor. What we now see is that the unequal endowment of rainfall among the islands leads us to concentrate on the unhealthy imbalance between the inflows and outflows of water resources within the region, and acting as a whole, the region can resolve this. So if you persist in arguing for a solution to the Caribbean water crisis, while at the same time refusing to include Dominica's water surplus, you are arguing with your own reflection and losing it. Let us continue. We can build the low rainfall and island-wide water scarcity narrative into a very interesting story. Now you have to follow closely because this factual progression that we will depict will come in 3 or 4 following slides. First, here's the map of the rainfall levels throughout the Caribbean region. You can see it is ranging from 35 inches per annum in the British Virgin Islands to 41 inches in Antigua. This same map can now be converted to reveal the water deficit situations that arise from these low rainfall levels. But notice that water deficit is not the situation in the island of Dominica. We list Dominica as having a water surplus situation. When we use the word surplus, it is assumed that Dominica has the capability to produce this extra volume of fresh water as a tradable quantity. Well, here's the key part. We are not assuming that. We know that. And we do so because the general manager of the Dominica Water Authority, DOWASCO, he told us so. Here is the communications from the general manager 8 years ago. In that communication, the GM is saying to me that he can commit himself at a time to 68 million gallons per month from the Cabritz line. But, and I quote him, until we can reinstate the bulk water line originating from the freshwater and Boeri lakes with a capacity to load as much as 6 million gallons per day. You do the math and see if it doesn't work out to 180 million gallons per month. On closer inspection of this map, you will find that when you add up all of the water deficit conditions we are aware of, together, they add up to just 10% less than the total water surplus we are claiming can come out of Dominica. So what we can legitimately take away from these facts is this. Water scarcity, as evidenced from an uneven distribution of rainfall endowment in the Eastern Caribbean, exists on an individual island basis. But when we take the Eastern Caribbean as a group, we are able to cover as much as 90% of the water deficit in an immediate potential available response. Still, the discussion about the technological solution finds welcome home in many influential parts, but not for economic reasons. Water technology is receiving a welcoming applause from those in the water services units who have a fixation on scarcity as the dreaded disease of the society's water system. It receives a welcoming applause from those in the influential techno-managerial authority, from academic to engineering circles, who have made the technological response to water challenges a high priority. And it receives a welcoming applause from government and non-governmental circles that promote desalination as our coming of age as an industrializing society. Some of the highest-ranking environmental officials in the Caribbean praise the desalination solution, but they seldom do so as a boast of its economic benefits. The best that they can muster is to see desalination as a more effective replacement method for water collection. In 2011, the Deputy Director of the 5Cs, while celebrating the completion of a desalination plant in Paget Farm in Bequia, could not resist from disparaging the past by saying this. We started with a pilot in Bequia, where during the dry season, water had to be barged from the mainland to Bequia. Now this is no longer necessary. For those of you who do not know, the 5Cs is the Belize-based Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, which is the flag bearer for climate-related initiatives in the Caribbean community. Yet, within 9 years later, in April 16, 2020, the Eyewitness News in St. Vincent was reported that the CWSA, that is, the Central Water and Sewage Authority of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the opposition leader were seen together trying to get a much needed water supply to Bequia, the same Bequia. Okay, you may question the motive of the opposition leader, Mr. Friday, as to whether he was purely on a photo op. But during that period, he made some very interesting observations. He said this: "We sort of take it for granted that in the Grenadines in the dry season, you will have a water problem, and it is just part of our lot. But in fact, we need to change that going forward." Then he made a simple statement, which in our view turns out to be a profound policy statement. This is it. We need to find a way to provide water immediately and then plan long term to get rid of this problem once and for all. Looking back from what has occurred, does the boast that the desalination plant in Bequia made barging water from the mainland to Bequia no longer necessary? Is that boast a valid statement on the right side of history? Or was it performance posturing? So when we see a commentator writing in the Antiguan Observer in 2016 that the issue of water shortage in Antigua and Barbuda is a matter that appears to have no clear solution, the drought continues to be problematic, and the APUA's task of providing adequate water to all its citizens has not been so simple. Or when we see the APUA itself promising us that the demand for water will be met by September 2025. The journalist doesn't know his history, and the APUA seems to be ignorant of their regional history. So what do you need to remember going forward? Take a deep breath. That the water shortage is a crisis to most of the individual islands in the Eastern Caribbean. However, to the Caribbean region as a hydrological domain, it is not. And to effectively deal with an uneven regional distribution of water endowment, somewhere in that mix, economic principles will need to be employed and promoted by a market-based action in the water system. In the next section, we will introduce you to the all-important difference between water resource management and water resource governance. This holds the key to understanding why a transboundary solution never got on the regional agenda for water security in the Eastern Caribbean. If you have enjoyed what you've heard so far, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and most importantly, share this with your friends. Thank you.